In the spring of 2019, in a town near the capital of Tennessee, 5 neighbors set fire to a Virgin Mary chapel in the middle of the night. In the morning, they went to the property to see the result. What they found in the ashes changed their lives forever. A Virgin Mary miracle that started with a gallon of kerosene and a decision none of them should have made. And it all started because of a small wooden chapel. But before we continue, do me a favor. Leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. You know that neighbor everyone looks for when there's a problem? Burst pipe, fallen fence, disagreement between neighbors. That guy who solves everything, who has an opinion about everything, who speaks loud and everyone listens. That was Donald Brewer, 53 years old. He'd lived in Tennessee for over 30 years in a small town, worked at a building materials distributor, knew every person on that street. Donald wasn't a bad man. Let's make that clear from the start. He wasn't the type of person who does things out of malice. He was the type of person who thinks he's always right. His wife, Karen, used to say Donald was like a train. Once he decided on a direction, there was no possible detour. Donald didn't go to church, didn't pray. Had nothing against those who did. It just wasn't his life. He believed in work, in solving problems with his hands, and in sleeping with a clear conscience. And for 30 years, that worked perfectly. Until the lady next door decided to build a chapel in her backyard. Margaret Holloway was 78 years old and had lived in that house longer than anyone on the street. Her husband had been gone for almost 10 years. Her grown family lived far away. She lived alone, but never seemed alone. There was always someone having coffee with her on the porch. The door was always open, and Margaret had a deep devotion to the Virgin Mary. Everyone knew that. In her living room, there was a statue of the Virgin Mary. But in March 2019, Margaret did something different. She had a small chapel built in the corner of her property, a small, simple space, wooden walls, sloped roof, a door that stayed open. Inside, a wooden image of the Virgin Mary about 2 feet tall, a bench for 2 people, and a candle stand. At first, nobody paid attention. It was just another Margaret thing. But then a neighbor started going there to pray early in the morning. Then another. Then a couple who lived 2 streets up. Within 3 weeks, Margaret's chapel had visitors every day, morning, afternoon, sometimes at night. Some praying, others lighting candles, others just sitting in silence. And that's when Donald started getting bothered. Strangers walking down the street, visitors standing on the sidewalk, talking, after praying. That was the beginning. Donald went to talk to Margaret. He was polite in his way, said he respected her faith, understood it was her property, but that the traffic was bothering him, that there were strangers circulating on the street. Margaret listened to everything, smiled, said she'd ask people to park somewhere else, and she did, and some changed. But the traffic kept growing. Not Margaret's fault. People just kept coming. Donald tried the formal route, went to the neighborhood association, filed a complaint, brought 3 neighbors along for support. The answer was simple. Margaret was within her rights. The property was hers. The chapel was within the boundaries. There was no violation. Donald didn't accept it. "This isn't right," Donald told Karen that night. "One person can't turn a residential neighborhood into a pilgrimage site." "It's not a pilgrimage site, Donald. It's about 10 people a day. Today it's 10. And tomorrow?" 2 months later, Donald had 4 neighbors with him who thought alike. Ray, Steve, Bill, and Tommy. None of them had a real problem with the chapel, but Donald knew how to talk. Donald knew how to convince. And when Donald said something would be a problem, people believed him, because Donald was never wrong. At least that's what everyone thought. In May 2019, Margaret was hospitalized. Nothing serious. A knee problem she'd been putting off for months that finally needed surgery. Her oldest son came from Atlanta, took Margaret to the hospital, and then to his house to recover. The expected time was 6 to 8 weeks away. Margaret's house was closed. The garden went untended. Without Margaret, nobody tended the candles. Nobody swept. Nobody opened the door in the morning. Some people still came to pray. But without Margaret there, the traffic decreased. Within 2 weeks, the chapel was practically abandoned. And Donald saw an opportunity. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a one-day decision. It was an idea that kept growing, first as a thought, then as a plan. The first time Donald mentioned it was at a barbecue at Ray's house on a Saturday afternoon. "You know that when Margaret comes back, that's going to start again, right?" Donald said. "More people, more cars, more confusion. And next time it'll be worse." "And what do you suggest?" Ray asked. Donald didn't answer right then, just left the question hanging. The second conversation was in Steve's garage a week later. This time Donald was more direct. "If that chapel doesn't exist when Margaret comes back, the problem ends," Donald said. "Simple as that." "You're talking about tearing it down?" Steve asked. "I'm talking about solving it," Donald answered. Nobody said yes that day, but nobody said no. The third conversation was the decisive one. It was on a Friday night in Donald's garage. 4 men and a decision none of them truly measured the consequences of. "If we tear it down, she'll build it again," Bill said. "Margaret is stubborn." "What if we burn it?" Donald said. Silence. You ever been in a conversation where someone says something that crosses a line? And everyone knows it crossed, but nobody says anything. It was exactly like that. Tommy was the first to speak after the silence. "When?" "Tomorrow night," Donald answered. 2 in the morning. The whole street will be asleep. Ever stop to think how decisions that change everything can happen in seconds? 4 men in a garage, 1 sentence, and done. Saturday, 2:15 in the morning. Tennessee was hot, even at dawn, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin. No wind, nobody on the street. All the house lights were off. Donald went out the back door, crossed the yard, jumped the low fence separating his property from Margaret's. Ray was already there. Steve arrived a minute later. Bill and Tommy came from the street, from behind. Nobody said anything. Donald brought a gallon of kerosene, poured it at the base of the wood, in the corners, on the bench. The strong smell of kerosene spread through the still night air. Donald lit the match. The old wood caught fire fast, faster than any of them expected. The chapel was small, and the dry wood consumed everything in minutes. When the flames died down, it was just embers. The fire didn't last long enough to wake the neighborhood. "Let's go," Donald said. The 5 left, each going their own way, without looking back. Donald went inside, took a shower, and went to bed. Karen was sleeping, didn't wake up. He lay on his back looking at the ceiling. His heart was still beating fast, but his head was strangely calm. It was done. The problem was solved. In the morning, there would only be ashes. Donald closed his eyes and slept all night. Like someone who thinks they did the right thing. Sunday morning, 6:40. Donald woke up with the alarm, made coffee, ate a piece of toast. The routine of every Sunday. Then went to the backyard and looked over the fence. The chapel no longer existed. What remained was a dark rectangle on the ground, ashes, pieces of roof. The bench had turned to charcoal. But there was something in the middle of all that. Donald squinted. It couldn't be. He jumped the fence, walked slowly to the center of the debris. The ashes crackled under his shoe, and there it was, the image of the Virgin Mary, standing, covered in ash, but intact. The wood hadn't burned, hadn't deformed. 2 feet of an image that should have turned to charcoal along with everything around it, and didn't. Donald stood there staring. Everything around was gone. Everything. The bench that was less than 3 feet from the image was ash. The wall that was behind it was charcoal. But the image was there, dirty, dark with soot, but intact. Donald looked around. The street was still empty. Nobody had seen. His head started working. Resistant material, he thought. Some kind of resin. Some treatment on the wood. There had to be an explanation. Everything has an explanation. He stood there for another 2 minutes. Then went back home. Didn't touch the image. Didn't say anything to Karen. Had another coffee and went to watch television. But the image stayed in his head. All day, Monday morning, the whole street knew. Not who had caused the fire. Nobody suspected that yet. But about the burned chapel and the image that survived. A neighbor named Denise was the first to see it. She was walking her dog at 7 in the morning and stopped in front of Margaret's property, saw the ashes, and saw the image standing in the middle of everything. Denise called 3 people in 10 minutes. Within an hour, there were neighbors in front of Margaret's property looking over the fence. "This is impossible," Denise told a neighbor. "It was pure wood. Everything burned, everything except her." "Must be a different material," the neighbor answered. "It's wood. Margaret showed me when she bought it. Solid hardwood." Donald heard this conversation from his porch. He was having coffee, pretending he wasn't paying attention. But he was. Every word. Ray showed up late morning. Parked in front of Donald's house and went straight to the garage. Donald was already there. "Did you see it?" Ray asked. "I saw it," Donald answered. "How is that possible?" "It's not impossible. There's an explanation. There always is." "Then give me one." Donald didn't answer. "Don, we poured kerosene all over that thing. I saw the fire. That chapel burned completely. Nothing survives a fire like that. There shouldn't be anything left." "I don't know, Ray. I'm not a scientist." "You're not stupid either. And you know this doesn't make sense." Ray left. Donald stayed in the garage the rest of the morning. Didn't do anything. Just sat there thinking. Days went by, and Donald tried to return to his routine. Work, home, television, sleep, same as always. But same as always wasn't the same anymore. Every morning when he left for work, he looked at Margaret's property. The image was still there, standing. Nobody had removed it. The image was simply there, dirty with soot, in the middle of the ashes, as if waiting for something. And people kept coming to see. They'd stop on the sidewalk, look, make the sign of the cross, leave. Some took photos, some prayed right there, on the sidewalk. But for Donald, each person who stopped was a reminder. This was growing. What was supposed to have ended the night of the fire was getting bigger. More eyes, more questions, more comments on the street. Ever notice how sometimes we do something thinking it'll solve a problem and the thing creates 10 new problems? Well, Donald was learning that the hard way. On Thursday, Bill showed up at the distributor where Donald worked. This had never happened before. Bill was discreet, reserved. If he was coming to Donald's work, it was because the matter was serious. "We need to talk," Bill said. "Not here," Donald answered. "Then where?" "Tonight. My garage." That night the 4 met again. The atmosphere was completely different. "Nobody knows anything," Donald said. "Nobody saw us. It'll pass." "And the image?" Ray asked. "The image won't pass. It's there, every day, intact. And I pass by there every day and see it. And every time I see it, I feel worse." "It's a wooden image, Ray. It didn't burn for some reason. Doesn't mean anything." "Then why don't you go there and remove it?" Donald didn't answer. "That's what I thought," Ray said. "You can't either." The meeting ended in silence. They left one by one. But this time, Donald didn't sleep well. Not from guilt, from something he couldn't define. Donald started waking up at 3 in the morning, would go to the kitchen, make coffee, sit in the dark. Karen noticed within the first week. "You're not sleeping," Karen said on a Friday morning. "Yes, I am." "Donald, I wake up and you're not in bed, every night." "Insomnia, it'll pass." "Since when do you have insomnia?" Donald didn't answer. Karen looked at him the way she looked when she knew something was wrong, but she didn't insist. Karen knew Donald. She knew that pushing didn't help. At the distributor, Donald started making mistakes on orders, small things, wrong quantity, switched address, nothing serious. But Donald never made mistakes. The boss noticed. His co-workers noticed. "Are you okay, Don?" the boss asked on a Tuesday. "I'm fine." "Doesn't seem like it." "I'm fine," Donald repeated, and the boss didn't bring it up again. But Donald wasn't fine, and with each passing day, it became clearer that what he was feeling wasn't just going to pass. You know that feeling when you know you did something wrong, but don't want to admit it, when the truth is right there, right in front of you, but you look away every time? Donald was living exactly that, every day, every night. In the third week, Ray came to Donald's house on a Sunday morning. "I need to tell you something," Ray said. "Come in." "No, right here outside." They stood on the porch. Ray was different, more tired, like he was carrying something too heavy. "I'm going to tell," Ray said. "Tell what?" "Everything." "Ray, have you lost your mind?" "No. Don, look at what we did. We burned the chapel of a 78-year-old lady, a lady who never hurt anyone. We solved a neighborhood problem." "No, we did the worst thing 5 men could do." Donald felt his face get hot. Not from shame, from discomfort, because when Ray spoke that way, Donald heard the truth, and the truth hurt. You know what's worse than someone accusing you of something? It's when the accusation is right, when every word the person says is exactly what you know is true, but you don't want to admit. Donald heard every word from Ray and felt the weight of all of them at once. "Give me 1 more week," Donald said. 1 week, then we decide together." Ray looked at him for a long time, then nodded and left. Donald stayed on the porch, alone, looking at Margaret's property where the image remained standing in the middle of the ashes. He asked for a week, but a week for what? To solve how? The problem wasn't Ray. The problem wasn't Steve or Tommy or Bill. The problem was that image that didn't burn. The problem was that Donald couldn't stop thinking about it. And for the first time in 53 years, Donald Brewer didn't know what to do. Margaret returned on a Wednesday. 4.5 weeks after surgery, her son brought her by car from Atlanta. They arrived around 3 in the afternoon. Donald was home. He'd left work early. From the upstairs bedroom, through the window, he saw the car park, saw the son get out, walk around, open the door for Margaret, saw Margaret get out slowly, her knee still bandaged. Saw her look at the house, smile. Then saw Margaret look at the backyard. The smile disappeared. Margaret walked slowly to the corner of the property. The son went after her, trying to hold her. When she reached where the chapel had been, Margaret stopped. Donald saw Margaret look at the ashes, saw the son say something, and then Margaret saw the image of the Virgin Mary, standing in the middle of everything. Margaret stood there looking for a time that seemed very long, and cried. That crying had no anger, not sadness exactly. Donald didn't know what it was. The son knelt beside her, held her hand. The two of them stayed there, in the middle of the chapel ashes, in front of the image of the Virgin Mary that didn't burn. Donald dropped the curtain and sat on the edge of the bed. His hands were shaking. It wasn't fear. It wasn't nervousness either. It was something else. It was seeing himself, really. It was looking at himself and seeing exactly what he was, a man who burned the chapel of a 78-year-old lady who never did anything wrong, who never raised her voice, who never complained about anything, who opened the door for anyone, who offered coffee to any stranger. Donald Brewer always thought he was a good man. In that moment, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. The following days were the worst of Donald's life. He'd go to work, come back, eat dinner in silence, go to bed, and stay awake. Karen stopped asking what was happening. She already knew Donald wouldn't answer. But the distance between them grew each day. On Sunday, he went to Margaret's property. The property was different. Someone had swept part of the ashes. The image had been cleaned. Someone had washed it. The Virgin Mary was there, in the same place, and around it on the ground there were white lilies and daisies. Donald stood there looking, and in that moment, in the middle of that burned property, with that clean image surrounded by flowers, Donald smelled something. Roses. It was a strong, intense smell that came from everywhere and nowhere. A smell of roses like he'd never smelled, as if someone had opened an entire garden next to him. The smell was so strong that he looked around, searching for where it came from. There were no roses. It lasted about 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then disappeared, as if someone had closed a door. Donald stood still, heart beating fast, legs weak. Donald was never a man of faith, never believed in signs, never believed in anything he couldn't touch, measure, explain. But in that moment, alone on that property, he felt something he couldn't explain. It was as if someone was there with him, someone who knew everything he had done, everything he felt, and who, even so, was there. Donald went back home, sat in the kitchen, and for the first time in 53 years, Donald Brewer cried. Monday morning, Donald called Ray. "Tonight, my garage, all 5. "What changed?" Ray asked. "Everything." That night, the 5 met in Donald's garage. Everyone was different. Almost a month had weighed on everyone. Donald stood up, leaning against the workbench, looked at each of them. "I'm going to tell Margaret," Donald said. Silence. "Tomorrow? I'm going to her house and I'm going to tell her everything, that I was the one who lit the match." "Don," Steve started, "I'm not finished. I'm going to take it alone." "You don't need to go with me. I planned it, I led it, I pay." "This is crazy," Bill said. Donald thought for a moment. "I'm not okay. I don't eat right. I can't look at my wife. I can't look at myself. And until I own up to this, it won't pass." Ray stood up. "I'm going with you." "Ray, you don't need to. I was there. I helped. I'm going with you." Tommy stood up too. "Me too." Steve looked at Bill. Bill looked at the floor, then raised his head. "All 5. If we did it together, we own up to it together." Donald felt something in his chest. It wasn't relief, but it was like an enormous weight had started to move, just an inch, but enough to feel that maybe things could be different. Tuesday, 9 in the morning. The 5 were on the sidewalk in front of Margaret's house. Donald rang the doorbell. Margaret opened the door. She had a cane, looked at the 5, and didn't seem surprised. "Margaret, we need to talk," Donald said. "Can I come in?" Margaret opened the door and made space. The 5 entered. The living room was exactly as Donald remembered from the few times he'd been there. Flowered sofa, old television, family photos on the walls, and in the corner an image of the Virgin Mary with a lit candle beside it. They stood. Margaret sat in the armchair. "Margaret, it was me," Donald said. "The fire at the chapel. It was me who did it, me and them. But the idea was mine. The planning was mine. The decision was mine." Margaret didn't say anything. Kept looking at Donald with those calm eyes she'd always had. "I did this because I wanted the chapel to disappear. Because I thought I had the right to decide that. And I was wrong. Of everything I've ever done in my life, this was the worst thing." Donald's voice failed on the last sentence. Margaret was silent for a time that seemed to last an hour. Then Margaret spoke. Slowly, with that calm voice she'd always had. "I know it was you, Donald," Margaret said. Donald's eyes widened. "I've known since the day I came back. Didn't need to be a detective. You were the only one who never came to ask me what happened. Everyone came. People I barely know. Everyone came to ask if I was okay, if I needed anything. You didn't, and you live next door." Donald felt his face burn. "But I also know something else," Margaret continued. "I know that you're here, that you came, that you're telling me the truth, looking in my eyes, and that, Donald, that's the hardest thing a man can do. Admit he was wrong." Margaret looked at Tommy, then looked at each of the 5 one by one, stopped at Donald. I'm going to do something you might not understand now, Margaret said. I'm going to forgive you. Nobody said anything. Not because what you did was small, it was big. It was very big. But because carrying resentment doesn't rebuild anything, and because if I ask for mercy every night before I sleep, then I need to be able to give mercy too. Otherwise, my faith is worth nothing. Donald tried to speak, couldn't. But I have one condition, Margaret said. Anything, Donald said. You're going to rebuild my chapel? Donald looked at Margaret. Expected anything. Expected to be sent away. Expected a lawsuit. Expected to pay for what he did. And in a way, Margaret was charging, but not the way he imagined. Not with resentment. With your own hands, Margaret completed. From the beginning, I want every board, every nail, every piece of this chapel to have your hands on it. I want every time you pass in front of it, you remember. The five were silent. Donald felt something strange. Relief wasn't the right word. It was respect. An enormous respect for that lady who had every right to do something about it and didn't. Yes, ma'am, Donald said. We're going to rebuild it. Donald started the following Saturday, alone, at 6 in the morning, went to Margaret's property with tools, cleaned what remained of the debris, separated the rubble, prepared the ground. Ray showed up at 7, without saying anything, grabbed a shovel and started working. Steve arrived at 8 with his truck loaded with boards. Margaret came out of the house at 9 with a tray, coffee, cookies, and juice, put it on a makeshift table and didn't say anything, just smiled and went back inside. Ever done something with your hands that had a different weight? Each board Donald placed was more than wood and nails, more than reconstruction, something bigger. On the first Saturday, they raised the foundation and pillars. On the second, the walls and roof structure. On the third, the finishing, the door, the paint. Donald made sure it was better than the original, more beautiful. On the third Saturday, Denise brought lunch for everyone. Another neighbor brought lemonade. A man who lived 3 houses up, whom Donald only knew by sight, showed up with a wooden bench he'd made himself. Varnished, beautiful, the right size. For the chapel, the man said. On the 4th Saturday, the chapel was ready. It was simple, but it was beautiful. Donald had used the best material he could get, had paid attention to every detail, not because it was an obligation, because it was the minimum. Margaret brought the image of the Virgin Mary and placed it in position on the pedestal Donald had built especially for it, then turned to the 5. "Thank you," Margaret said. 3 months later, the street was different. Margaret's chapel was still there. People kept coming to pray. New faces appeared on the sidewalk, and Donald wasn't bothered anymore. It's not that he'd become another person. Donald was still Donald, still spoke loud, still had an opinion about everything, still was the guy everyone looked for when there was a problem. But something had changed, something that people noticed but couldn't explain. Karen knew. Donald told her everything the night the chapel was finished. Everything. Karen listened without interrupting. Donald started sleeping again. The insomnia gradually decreased. The mistakes at work stopped. His appetite returned. It was as if his body had been waiting for his head to get right. Margaret never told anyone who set fire to the chapel. Not even her son knew. That stayed between her and the 5. Ray started going to the chapel from time to time, would sit on the bench, stay in silence, leave. If you ask Donald if it was a miracle, he'll say he doesn't know. He'll say there's probably an explanation. But if you look in his eyes when he says that, you'll notice something different. You'll notice that Donald Brewer, the man who didn't believe in anything he couldn't touch, measure, and explain, isn't so sure anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest miracle of this story. A man who found something he didn't even know he was looking for. Before we finish, I want to make you a very special invitation. Come be part of our Virgin Mary prayer community with people from various places around the world, sharing the same faith. If you feel in your heart the desire to participate in this prayer chain, click the button below, become a channel member, and come pray with us. And look, if you made it this far, to the end of Donald and Margaret's story, do something for me. Write in the comments chapel, because that's where it all began. I want to see how many hearts this story truly reached, and every time I read chapel in the comments, I'll know that one more person believes that miracles still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Write in the comments about some miracle you've witnessed or experienced, and share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.